Climate Week. So I would ask everyone if you could please start taking your seats. We had some sort of delay with the schedule we had originally planned.
Be in this session speaking in English and in Spanish. It will be a good idea if you need translation to use. There are several machines that you can use for the translation. So just get your device. Bueno, muy bien. ¿Qué tal, colegas?
Very well, dearest colleagues. In this specific session, in regards to the global stock take, it's a grand opportunity so that we can reflect on this very important mechanism. Based on the Paris Accords, we have some goals in regards to decarbonization. We also have a goal in regards to accelerating actions in a region and goals for resiliency. This process that was defined by the Paris Accords should contribute to further accelerating these actions, should contribute to our ambition so that we are able to reach our long-term global goals. What we would like today with this event is to be able to reflect on what the region needs. What are those policies? What are those projects? What are those investments? How to mobilize the public and private stakeholders to ensure that we are able to reach our goals. And what is it that we need from international cooperation? How are we a lot more effective to be a lot to close the gaps, to be able to reach those goals? But we have a region that has a huge potential with a lot of biodiversity and human talent, a lot of resource and traditional knowledge, along with our indigenous communities, that we need to be able to accelerate this action. It's what we will talk about in the framework of this event. The event is structured in 3 main segments. We will have an opening segment. Since we're somewhat delayed, I will request on behalf of our panelists to ensure that we go right to the point. To ensure that we are specific, we will hear from the Minister of Cuba. She will be the keynote speaker. She will give us a reflection in regards to what the GST needs in regards to the vision in regards to decarbonization and resiliency. And after that, we will have a panel with the representation from different stakeholders, public, private, and youth. So this is going to be a grand event. Without further ado, I would now like to call up to the podium David Cooper, Director of the UNFCCC, so that we could start with the event in a formal manner. So, Mr. Cooper, if you could please come to the stage.
Quite a remarkable audience here. It's like the who's who of the who's who. It is always a tremendous feeling of joy when you get the opportunity to engage with people who actually make decisions. Most of us recommend decisions, but some few of us actually make them. And this is an opportunity for those who make those decisions to chat with each other, to see what the commonalities are and how were they addressed in your country And how does that guide others in doing the same thing? Now, this has more than just an implication for the Latin American and Caribbean region. The implication is global. The region is noted for its innovative approaches. It has very good infrastructure nationally, which allows solutions to be implemented effectively. It gives the full spectrum of very large countries and very tiny ones, with everything in between. So it's a microcosm of the world. And what solutions are effective here are going to be effective globally. To give you an example, the climate change convention process has had a lot of difficulty finding the starting point on which to discuss and negotiate loss and damage. It was the small island developing states of the Latin American and Caribbean region that shifted that discussion to how do you address the difficulties associated with natural disasters, in particular hurricanes. That the response to these events are, in fact, loss and damage. It opened a corridor for that to be discussed and for especially vulnerable countries to have a loss and damage fund established to assist them, opening the process to now discuss how the world will address for everyone loss and damage. That leadership and guidance came from this region. So the clear world view is check to see what's going on in Latin America and the Caribbean to give us a guide on where we should go. Friends, this year, the regional climate weeks have been designed to center around the global stocktake, the key mechanism to enhance ambition. And I emphasize enhance, not create. Ambition exists. The actions of parties have brought the curve down in the correct direction to achieve 1.5. The issue is we need more. You've got the right answers, but we need them implemented more. Today's high-level segment gives an opportunity to amplify the voices, the vision and the ideals of the region, and to give guidance to COP28 in the United Arab Emirates on where those solution pathways are. The global stocktake allows us to have an assessment of how we have performed. Not to say we did a great job or we did a poor job, but to say these are the areas where we need to expand our efforts. To give guidance to countries when they produce their biennial transparency reports on their achievements against their nationally determined contributions, and when they are going to make even greater commitments based on their achievements. All parties, not just those in the Latin American and Caribbean region. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to briefly highlight how far we have come with the global stocktake process in assessing the collective progress and cite some of the recommendations from the technical assessment on how we need to course correct. The 3 technical dialogues of the global stocktake concluded during the subsidiary body meetings in Bonn of this year, SB 58, and a factual synthesis report by the co-facilitators was published in September the 8th of this year. As a secretariat, we welcome this and also the contribution of the wide variety of stakeholders led by the parties. One word stands out amongst all of this. That's that it was the technical result. Technical results don't change the world. Political ones do. And that's the process that we are engaging in now. The outcomes of the technical assessment produced this synthesis report, and it confirms what we all know. The Paris Agreement has driven the process forward and driven it in the right direction. Collectively, we are simply not doing enough. We need to assign where we can do more and look at areas where we are doing exceptionally well and spread those areas to more countries. Global emissions do not keep us below 1.5 degrees. I asked yesterday some of my colleagues, what world are we living in today? And they told me we are living in about a 1.1 degree world. And a 1.1 degree world is not turning out to be so great. We've got a lot of natural disasters, events, unprecedented warming, unbelievable amounts of flooding, as well as drought, cyclones and hurricanes in a 1.1 degree world. What happens in a 1.2 degree world and a 1.3 degree world? The incentive is there for us to all seek to achieve the maximum we can to achieve the lowest possible temperature increase. Not because we are saving the planet, because we're saving ourselves. I want to strongly encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity to engage with each other, to determine what actions you can take. Even as an individual, remember that whatever you decide to do in your personal life as an individual, you probably have several million friends around the world that you don't even know, who are probably deciding to do exactly the same thing. So your action is multiplied by everything that they are doing. So don't think of it as one person doing a little. One person and your several million friends doing a little that contributes to being a lot. We were urged to be brief, and therefore I ignored it, but I will come to a conclusion now. The world can do impressive things. We all lived through one of the most unbelievable experiences over the last 5 years. And the world did not say, it's too big, or the process is too entrenched. We cannot do anything. COVID-19 came along, and there was no choice. Deal with it. Governments found ways and dealt with it. The world changed in a very short period of time. Imagine somebody sneezing on an airplane could cause a country to shut its borders. That is how small an event can produce a huge result. So if it can happen under those circumstances, how can we reproduce them in more positive ones to save our world? I am very grateful that the people of your countries have you and your vision representing them effectively, efficiently, and without tiring. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your continued leadership globally and for ensuring that we all stay on a pathway that keeps our world around for many generations to come. Thank you all very much, and I wish you every success with your deliberations.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper. Y después de estas reflexiones voy a invitar
Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper. After these reflections, I'll invite the Vice Minister Diana Laguna from Panama, which is our host country. She has been a gracious host in a very complex moment that the country is living through. So we thank you for your presence, Madam Vice Minister. And please, so that you can give your opening remarks.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. Once again, I would like to welcome you to our dearest country, even though it's somewhat going through some difficulties today. Despite this, I hope that you are able to enjoy this beautiful city. I send you a warm greeting on behalf of our President, Laurentino Nito Cortizo, and on behalf of the Minister of Environment, Milciades Concepcion. In the next few hours, he will be visiting the Climate Week and engaging with us. But right now, he's working on some of these issues that we now must look at as a country. To address the climate change crisis, we must systematically transform our economy, but also our society. This includes eliminating fossil fuel gradually and align financial flows with climate goals and address the loss and damages of developing states. Historical emissions, but also current emissions of GHG are being distributed in an unfair manner among regions, among countries, and individuals. And most of it is because of CO2 emissions that come from fossil fuel and also from industrial processes. To be able to eliminate global warming and down to 1.5 degrees, countries must reduce their GHG emissions by 45% by 2030 and to continue to reduce the emissions even after 2030. In this manner, we will be able to limit this global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is certainly our objective. The GST, it's an opportunity so that the countries are able to address the climate crisis in a strategic manner, assessing the efforts carried out after the Paris Accords to date. And we hope that it will generate a comprehensive amount of results to be able to transform our economies, our societies, and to create a sustainable future for everyone. Developing countries that are highly vulnerable are now undertaking huge efforts to be able to address climate change. And these efforts are essential to be able to protect people, but also the most vulnerable communities from the impact of climate change. Nevertheless, these countries do not receive enough support to be able to implement each of the efforts required. The lack of technology transfer, along with enough support, it's now exercising an additional pressure upon the economy of our countries. The GST must recognize the efforts of the developing countries, which are highly vulnerable, and also to provide the support that they need to be able to address climate change. The impact of climate change is now increasing, and the efforts in regards to adaptation are not enough, and we are now seeing loss and damages. the GST must also address the loss and damage that have already occurred, specifically towards our most vulnerable populations. As we have already stated, we must act now to be able to address this crisis. We need to reduce emissions of GHGs, and we also need to increase the efforts in regards to adaptation. Without further ado, we give you the warmest welcome once again to our country, Panama, to the Climate Week and to this space of dialogue in regards to the global stock take. Thank you very much and welcome once again. Thank you very much, Madam Vice Minister. And now we will start with the panel. We will ask the members of the panel to please come up to the podium so that we can start with this part of the session. I will ask Madam Vice Minister, Ms. Diana, if you could come up, and also Minister Maria Susana Mohammed, the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia, and also a representative from Trinidad and Tobago, Keishan, on that side.
Mental agreements to please come to the stage. También al señor.
And we do have the names assigned to the seats. And here, Mr. Camilo Sanchez. He's a Director of Sustainability for South America and the Caribbean of CEMEX. And to Ms. Gabrielle Helen de Oliveira. She's a representative of indigenous people. If you could please come up as a representative of youth. Welcome. Very well. And now that you know that we are somewhat delayed in our agenda, but we will certainly try to ensure that this conversation in regards to the GST would give us very concrete messages. So I would try to do a conversation format in regards to bringing about these points that are very key. As we've heard, we need to accelerate our actions, not only to reach the goals in regards to decarbonization, but also to be able to achieve the level of resiliency in a highly vulnerable region. But it's also a region that has a lot of potential and could certainly promote innovation and to try to have coherent public policy and incentives that are aligned with that specific vision. But we also need to be able to mobilize the financial flows in a manner that is consistent with its needs. So this conversation in regards to the GST and in regards to seeing that it's a mechanism to elevate the ambition in the framework of the Paris Accords to comply with these objectives and goals, which is what we need. So without further ado, I will now start with the Vice Minister, Madam Diana. And thank you very much once again for being here. And from these objectives, what are these grand opportunities and what are those maybe political signs and signals that we need so that this global stock take can contribute to accelerating action?
Sí, buenos días.
Good morning. At the national level, at the level of national policies, the Panamanian government is doing a lot in order to achieve that balance. We need to be able to do it locally first in order to then do it worldwide. We are focusing on a just transition into a low-emission GHG economy, an economy that includes the entire population of the Republic of Panama, just like SDGs says. without leaving anyone behind. Panama today has the first climate displaced people due to the sea level rise, a small island in the Panamanian Caribbean. And after the analysis that we have done as far as, well, analysis and the models on the sea level rise, we know that this is a vulnerable region. We have accounted more than 63 populations that from now until 2050 are vulnerable and can be affected by the rise of sea level. The calculation says that about 2% of our territory is vulnerable to that rise.
Es importantísimo.
In that aspect, research is extremely important. We must also implement policies to reduce this harm and become a resilient country. These populations are usually populations of extreme poverty, and our indigenous peoples are the ones that are being affected the most, as well as the coastal populations. We are implementing programs and projects for the adaptation and mitigation of these populations. We must drive ambitious agendas as well. We must act and support national actions. We need to delve into research so we can then create policies, as I mentioned. The moment to act is now. We must act. We must act soon, and we need to make deep changes in our policies. We must create smart strategies so we can then reduce that acceleration in climate change and then create a more adapted and resilient planet to climate change. This is a great responsibility that we have. Thank you.
Gracias, gracias, viceministra.
Thank you, Vice Minister. And based on some of the elements mentioned by the Vice Minister, I would like to move to Her Excellency, Ms. Susana Mohama. We spoke about adaptation, a vulnerable region to climate change, and without a doubt, we know that livelihoods are being affected of many of these vulnerable populations and also ecosystems. We see great harm in our ecosystems. Therefore, what do we need for the global stocktake to take us to that moment? What do we need so we can then catalyze all those investments and projects? How can we make that our development model respects the planetary limits, and at the same time we can advance and go through all the difficulties in the social and the political aspect? Good morning, everyone. I would like to mention that this is also a geopolitical game. We can not only think about this climate problem from a technical process vision, that we have technical solutions, that we must mobilize sectors, and that will solve the changes when we are playing a geopolitical game. What do I mean? There are power differences and different interests. The first call is that if the interest of the people of Latin America wants to be reflected in the global stocktake conversation, the Latin American governments have the responsibility to have at least 1, 2, or 3 joint stands. Unfortunately, Latin America has not been able to negotiate this bloc in a collective manner, something that we see is different in other continents. For example, Africa. They know, they have learned, they have the structure to do bloc negotiations. In Latin America, we have great differences of position, and I believe that we shouldn't focus on that if we don't put that on the table, because these are fundamental differences. For example, the position or the stance on fossil fuels. There are countries that still believe that the first decade development process that based on the extractivism, we are going to solve the social inequality model. And other countries believe that we must overcome the extractivism process and that we need transitions that will allow us to create economies based on the strategies of our continent, our biodiversity. However, this should not prevent us to agree in maybe 2 or 3 things and then defend those things in the global stocktake. I would like to propose maybe 2 or 3 topics. This would give us a strength as a region, and that strength can be translated into a regional investment portfolio, a transformation portfolio. So it brings the light in to Latin America with our own geopolitical stance. Another aspect is how we can strengthen the public power. We can do it by reducing the debt accumulated by many of our countries in what we have called the debt for nature swap agreement, because all the countries, medium countries, smaller countries, are having fiscal issues to be able to invest in these transitions. The market will not solve the problem of climate migrants. The market will not solve the problem of ecosystems that are collapsing. And with that collapse, we have the collapse of cultures, communities, and food securities, energy securities, etc. Another important topic is our unified position when we face the renewable transition, the just energy transition. This cannot be at risk of biodiversity. We cannot repeat the cycle of extractivism of minerals in order to export them so then they can sell us the technology and our ecosystems are left devastated and we end up buying costly technology without a balance between the ecosystemic functions, the security of our adaptation, which is our main agenda, and the need of the energy change. So I believe that this topic is another powerful message. Energy transition. The COP goal cannot happen at risk of biodiversity. We need to replace fossil fuels. We shall not increase the energy capacity of the world, sustaining fossil fuels and creating renewables. At the end, we are going to surpass the environmental limits. Another third topic that I would like to propose, and this can be a block, we have an urgent need of early alert systems at the detailed scale. It's a matter of saving lives and understanding if we still have adaptation spaces. What is happening with nature transitions so we can also transition into a permanent era of climate change. What we see from our countries is the collapse of the ecosystem. We are at the verge of an ecosystemic collapse of an important biome like the Amazonia. We see what's happening with El Niño. We see the droughts. We see our collective inability of the Amazonian countries to respond to that challenge of forest fires and a historical low of water levels in the Amazonian. This is something that we see in real time. And this could lead us to Latin America must maintain the political discussion. This is part of democracy. We must continue that debate. But at the same time, we must jointly develop maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 regional scale-up initiatives so we can present to the world. There's one connected to saving the Amazonian. Maybe in 5 years, Latin America can change the landfills and reduce methane gases by a percentage so we can show the world the type of impact in the temperature for global warming. Just like President Petro proposed, we can create a connectivity line between Patagonia and Alaska so we can feed it with renewable energy and help the U.S. decarbonize. Scale up regional initiatives that mobilize funding, but also that mobilize populations, because in Latin America we cannot build anything without bases or without having a fundamental component of social inclusion. I believe that our voice would have a different nature and our capacity to influence would place us at a different geopolitical place that unfortunately we don't have right now. Woo! How many ideas! Great! Thank you, thank you. We have many challenges and many concrete ideas here. Fantastic. That's the idea. The idea is for us to see the converging points so we can then mobilize the resources we need so we can improve our population's qualities of lives, protect our ecosystems, and we have interesting proposals here. Now I will switch to English to speak to Mr. Kishan Kumanstein.
Really having an issue pronouncing your name, so I apologize for this. The other big element that we are discussing here around the global stocktake and how can it influence the loss and damage conversation that we're having. We're hearing a lot about a region facing so much challenges and what is required for the global stocktake to support efforts in minimizing and averting loss and damage and catalyzing a just transition. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. The global stocktake, as we know, is enshrined in the Paris Agreement and is intended to take stock, as it says, of the place we are in as a world in achieving the objectives and the goals of the Paris Agreement, including the temperature goal. And it's the objective and implementation of the Paris Agreement as a whole, not selected parts of the Paris Agreement. This global stocktake, therefore, is perhaps the most important of all of the stocktakes that are to come, because this is really new ground that we are covering, but it will also set the precedent for future stocktakes. The three phases that we have engaged in that will culminate in Dubai at COP28 was meant to provide information and data as far as possible to inform what needs to be addressed as a result of the outcome of the global stocktake. So it is perhaps the most critical element of the trajectory, or where we assess where we are going. In respect of loss and damage in the Paris Agreement is also a standalone article. So if we are talking about taking stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, then we have to take stock of the implementation of every article and every provision of the Paris Agreement. And therefore, the issue of loss and damage must be addressed as a standalone element and not linked to any other aspects such as adaptation, for example. The linkages, therefore, of the various issues within the global stocktake must be contextualized so that the outcomes can be taken stock of and inform parties of what needs to be done. We heard that we are already at 1.1 or maybe 1.15, I think was the latest figure, if I were to go 2 decimal places, already of global warming, with unprecedented accelerated rates of climate change. We are perhaps expected to reach 1.5 in another decade and a half to 2 decades. And we're already seeing the impacts of climate change throughout the world, more particularly on vulnerable countries such as small island states. And we have already experienced that with increasing severity and frequency in the Caribbean region. So whatever comes out of GST in the context of loss and damage must inform action, not only in respect of addressing the issue of loss and damage on a whole, but addressing issues such as temperature constraints, or to constrain the temperature in future, to minimize and avert loss and damage in the future, which is how loss and damage is defined in the process. So that precedent needs to be set. In respect of just transition is already recognized in the Paris Agreement in the preamble, of course. But it would be key for the GST to also address just transition in the broader context of the energy transition that is needed to achieve net zero, which is also a provision on objective of the Paris Agreement. So that the GST outcome must address and acknowledge the role of the just transition process in advancing and how it can advance the Paris Agreement and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Because if just transition will also address issues of equity and climate justice, and we just heard of some of those issues. And it's not only about the energy transition, but it's about leaving no one behind, including those that are affected by the adverse impacts of climate change, because there are those communities that live off sustainable livelihoods that depend on the natural resources. And if those natural resources are impacted on by the adverse impacts of climate change, then those communities and those people will be disenfranchised. And therefore, they will also lose livelihoods. And therefore, if we are talking about just transition and we talk about climate justice, then everyone needs to be catered for in that. And I think that should be incorporated into global stocktake, because the Paris Agreement recognizes that no one should be left behind, and addressing vulnerable groups such as indigenous peoples and so on. So in summary, for both just transition and loss and damage to be incorporated in the discussions of the GST, it should emphasize the important roles of equity, climate justice, but all of the discussion must be steeped in scientific evidence, which has now become irrefutable. And with the AR6, the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, but also with even more recent scientific publications. So the GST has to take into consideration in that negotiation process science as the basis and as the primary premise, as well as everyone, leaving no one behind, and including every aspect of the Paris Agreement implementation. It should be honest, it should be candid, and it should allow countries to really take stock, to look themselves in the mirror and say, okay, this is what we need to do collectively. Let's get on with it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for these reflections about the scope of the global stocktake. Again, super important issues. Thank you for this contribution. Vamos ahora a escuchar.
Now let us hear the vision from the private sector. At the end, all the transformations, all the transitions involve the societies. And when I say involve societies, we need to speak about base communities, indigenous peoples, and the private sector. How can we articulate and how can we make this global stocktake? We have gaps in funding, technology transfer, capacity building. How can we close those gaps? So what is the vision that we have in the private sector? Thank you, dear Andrea. Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here today. This is the decade of results. We have only 7 years to take action. We have spoken about the meaning of 1.1 degree Celsius and what that means. This is a topic where the planetary limits are being violated, and we must take action. The challenges in the construction sector are huge. We are part of one of the sectors that generate important emissions. But we have a lot of solutions to bring to the table as well. The demand of cement and concrete to overcome poverty, inequality, and access to housing will double from now by 2030 if we want our communities to develop. But that development cannot happen in the same way we have seen it in the last few years. Companies like Cemex are globally committed to initiatives like First Movement Coalition and other initiatives aligned to that 1.5 degrees Celsius idea. And our goals have been validated. The good news is that it is possible to achieve a low emissions, resilient, and circular development, including our communities. In that sense, in the last 2 years, we have had a 9% reduction, something that in the past took more than 10 years to achieve. However, we were able to capture some of the benefits to work in a more efficient way, working with other enterprises, with communities, on nature-based solutions, on energy transition elements, but we still have a gap. And on this global stocktake, I would like to mention 5 elements that from our company, our sector, we consider fundamental for the products that should build sustainable development can happen in that framework, aligned with the climate needs, adaptation, and biodiversity. The first element, and Minister Susana made some reflections on this, solid waste. Solid waste in our region generate more than 6% of emissions, among them methane, 28 times more powerful than CO2. We cannot continue burying solid waste. If we want energy transition, we need to stop sending waste to those places, and we need to move into recycling and co-processing. This will help us to transit or to move from fossil fuels into other materials while we create other materials with high contents of biomass. This requires prohibitions, concrete goals, and actions within the normative frameworks for each country. We have another sector, an important sector that is lowly quantified, the excavation, demolition sector. We don't have the right quantification, but these are useful materials for a circular development, and we have seen the option to reduce the pressure on natural resources and moving into these types of options. That normative framework is extremely important. The second one is related to the transition and carbon prices. If we want to speed up, we need carbon pricing for this transition to happen. Systems like bonds are functional, but the systems must be just, allowing costs and access to our communities to the product so they can develop. It is also important to have mechanisms like systems at the borders. We cannot do anything if a country is committed, and on the other side, there are imports that can even increase this situation. How can we make that the resources of developed countries can migrate and accelerate the transition? Article 6 gives us part of the answer, but we must accelerate the frameworks so we can generate that transition. We have technological options, so we need to advance in the carbon capture because it is necessary, but we also have options to capture through nature-based solutions and regeneration. We have identified projects that can contribute to our communities by strengthening the ecosystem services to capture carbon, but we need time frames in order to create those conventions. The fourth element, renewable energies, the energy transition. Many countries present here have normative frameworks that are ideal for that promotion. Some countries are reaching 90% on renewable energies. So we need to continue working with incentives so we can project the demand that is going to be more than doubling our sector so we can transition into decarbonization. And finally, that demand of our product. Remember that concrete is the second most used product in the world after water. With all the measures that I already mentioned, We need to have construction codes that recognize the low carbon footprint and low water footprint that are part of the public policy. If we are going to invest in housing and infrastructure, we must recognize the efforts that many of the countries are making in that sense. With the support of all the leaders present here and the regulatory frameworks, we are going to be able to achieve that transition below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Thank you. Thank you, Camilo. Thank you. And this is a clear reflection of what the private sector needs. A lot of coherence in the regulatory frameworks and those policies. And this is a regional vision, reinforcing again the comments made by Minister Mohammed. And we cannot close this panel without hearing the voice of the youth. What do you expect so the global stocktake can contribute to elevating our ambition in climate action?
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. I am Gabrielle. I am indigenous Porcarado from the north area of Brazil. I am part of the indigenous people of Brazil, the APIBE, and the global partnership in regards to territorial communities. I'm here to bring the voices of boys and girls, a youth that fight for climate justice of the UN, Youngo. It's very important to be able to ensure that youth are part of this collective capacity building in regards to our environment, our biomas. We are living a critical time in history as we go through that planetary crisis. Then it's important for us to get to this moment where we finally look behind in regards to what we have promised. And the youth from Young Go have some demands in regards to everything that's been happening within the environment. First, allowing effective collaboration between the state, the private sector, and the non-state actors. Also to institutionalize the grassroots communities at a state level to be able to reach solutions in regards to decarbonization at a state level and to improve the situation of vulnerable populations. This is something that could be done by creating bridges between different organizations as different mechanisms and to inform non-stakeholders, actors in regards to objectives in the Paris Accords, the SDGs, and ensure that this is all accessible to the public in regards to standardizing resources for all and to guaranteeing the developing of the skills of non-state actors and financial and technical support that is necessary to ensure to carry out these types of reports, to consider the experiences of the groups that are affected in the terrain and of the indigenous people, along with the knowledge of indigenous women. We need to ensure that you listen to us because youth is here to fight in the defense of our bioma, of our environment, against climate change. And we need for you to be with us together in this fight together. And we're committed against climate change. We're committed to fight for territorial rights for our biomas. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gabriela. Thank you so much for that commitment. It's so important and it inspires us so much. I'll ask the panelists to stay here so that we can then have a closing speech on behalf of the Ministry of Science and Technology of the Republic of Cuba, Elba Rosa Perez Montoya, that after listening to this, dearest Minister, I think that there's so many elements to be able to have a closing intervention. Good day, everyone. Dearest Vice Minister Diana Laguna, dear members of the panel, distinguished ministers invited, I thank for the invitation on behalf of Cuba and the Ministry of Science, Technology and the Environment, the Secretariat of the UNFCCC, to present some ideas for the debate, which have now been fertilized, as you can see, for the global stock take under the mandate of the Paris Agreement. The ideas that I have drafted and that I will now share with everyone here have as a foundation the questions, guiding questions that were sent in the concept note for being part of this debate. And I'll remind you briefly what are the main opportunities and political signs that are necessary so that the global stocktake can move forward in regards to action and support to the Paris Agreement, and what is needed through global stocktake to support adaptation and the achievement of the adaptation globally. How can a regional global stocktake fill in the critical gaps that we have in regards to the implementation and support in finance and capacity building and technology transfer? How can we use the global stocktake to be able to guarantee the challenges and the voices of the developing countries and to ensure that they are listened to at the global climate meetings? What are the opportunities within the assessment process to be able to move forward in the sustainable development priorities and a just transition? As you can observe, many of these topics have already been addressed with very concrete initiatives as to how to move forward to be able to take this to the COP. I'll give you a few perspectives. First, I'll talk about the political signals that must be given from the stocktake in support of the Paris Agreement so that this is an effective exercise. We need to ensure that the results are not only balanced, they need to be realistic and they must be applicable. When I talk about being balanced, I mean that you must keep in mind all the different visions in regards to the effective manner to be able to fight against the climate change, and also the relative weight of the different elements that make negotiations today. The result must bring enough satisfaction to everyone and to gradually think about the future we want to reach so that at the same time we can do a critical stocktake as to how we were able to make it here. When I talk about realistic and applicable, I mean that the global stocktake must reflect purposes and goals that are possible to implement as soon as the end of COP28, and not something that it's everlasting in time. These objectives need to be able to recognize differences in some of the national situations and the development goals. When we talk about the SDGs and economic and social priorities that many countries face in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also developing countries as a whole. So this stance is quite consistent with the Forum of Latin America and the Caribbean in regards to sustainable development in May of 2023, through which they highlighted the comprehensive of the 2030 Agenda 17 SDGs and the need of redoubling our efforts to be able to achieve the goals already established. In general, the specificities of the region must be recognized within this process. ECLAC highlights that the growth pattern of Latin America translates in a greater amount of vulnerability of the region in regards based on the impacts of the pandemic and of loss of GDP and also of employment. And it's something that has gone over the amounts in the rest of the world. IPCC estimates that mid-rising temperatures will continue to increase in Latin America and the Caribbean at a rate greater than the global average. Within this scenario, the global adaptation goal, well, it's something that is a regional priority, and that in the very first place, we need to ensure that it's agreed at COP28 in a manner that is able to satisfy the interests and the needs of developing countries, which today are the main victims of climate change that they have barely contributed to. That result must be included to the global assessment, which should create a roadmap to be able to move forward in applying this objective, which would lead to strengthening of our way of adaptation. In regards to implementation, the results of our global stocktake must be very sound, and to ensure that the developed countries are able to provide signs that so that in COP29 we're able to have a new ambitious financial goal and to have a profound change of our current financial situation or system, which is not responding to the needs and urgency of Latin America and the Caribbean and developed countries as a whole. Effective operation of the loss and damage fund will be a key element that must reflect and further promote global assessment into it. In regards to the question as to how this assessment can ensure that the challenges and the voices of developing countries are heard, we would reiterate that it's necessary to ensure that the principles of the convention are highlighted. We should not move away from it, specifically in regards to recognizing the historical responsibilities, common responsibilities, but also highlighting the differences and ensuring equity. In the most recent years of climate negotiations show the growing trend in regards to eroding those specific principles, moving away from those principles, meaning that the global stocktake should be a space to be able to deter those and to conserve the fundament of climate negotiations. Of all the elements that have been mentioned and many others by the group of the G77 and China, presided over by Cuba at this point, if they're included in the global stocktake, then we will have a result that will favor the sustainable development priorities and a just transition that would allow visible progress in a new 5-year cycle that would further promote the capacity of the region. But in regards to climate issues, we must talk not about long or midterm, but rather now. With that common vision in regards to decide results for COP30 that will be held in the city of Benin, then we need to do everything and all the challenges need to be taken into account. These are just a few ideas to not take too much time away. And these are just some elements for debate and for the exchange, aside from what the panelists have already stated. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Minister, and thank you very much to my distinguished panelists. These reflections have left us inspired. I think that there are several elements that are quite interesting that we brought to the agenda. There is a political debate that's very important that must be recognized, that we must define many of those visions and a regional stance. It's possible to build it. And here we've heard some of those proposals from the vision of the public sector, but also what the private sector and the voice of youth, which talks about a permanent commitment. Latin America, a region with so much natural richness and cultural riches, that without a doubt is able to contribute to bring about concrete solutions. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for your inspiration.
Eso es la bandera de fondo. Pero vamos. Estamos haciendo fotos cada 2 o 3 años. Cada 2 o 3 años, pero bueno. Pero tú estás como él, porque estás igualito. Bueno, hay que cuidar. Y empezó jovencito. Sí, pero hay una campaña. Vamos. Sí, ya la puso así más o menos. A ver si más o menos sale.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, may I please ask you to take your seats? We would like to begin the session on adaptation and finance. We would like to invite His Excellency Orlando Habe of Belize to the podium, Excellency Juan Cabadin of Argentina, Excellency Matthew Samuda from Jamaica, Miguel Angel Zeron Cid from Mexico, Les Farouki of UNDP, Gonzalo Munoz, the high-level champion for Global Ambassador.
Ladies and gentlemen, of course, led ably by our honorable ministers, our excellencies. I always wanted to be an ambassador, so everyone would call me Your Excellency. I ask you to take your seats and bring your A game. I get the role of being the warm-up act, mainly because I've had the privilege of knowing this particular person who is going to moderate the session for quite some time. Through the actions that he and a large number of international experts have undergone in doing the reviews of the greenhouse gas and biennial reports and biennial update reports, submissions by parties, they have built national capacity across climate, all fields, in all countries. Quite a remarkable achievement when the goal was simply to do a review of the submissions that countries made. But in doing so, he and his colleagues changed the nature of that interaction so that it became facilitative and capacity building for developing countries. So Harry has this unique perspective of seeing virtually all aspects. To be honest with you, I'm very jealous that he gets to do this particular session and I don't, because it's looking at adaptation and finance, two of the most important parts of the entire process to this region. We have begun to see how finance is being looked at much more broadly. It's not just to provide the resources, but it has to be provided in a way that it can be effectively used. And Harry is one of those who has been championing to ensure that the assistance matches the need and generates the results. So I have the pleasure of introducing you to our substitute chair and ask him to take over the podium and lead us through this session involving the adaptation and finance. Harry, I put everybody in your tender care.
Thank you, Don, for this nice introduction. Also from my side, welcome to all of you. Good morning, distinguished excellencies, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and honored guests. I now open this segment where we will hear national statements on topics of adaptation and finance. I would like to urge to our distinguished speaker to kindly observe a 3-minute time slot for statements during this segment. Dear distinguished excellencies, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, let us begin with the first speaker. We now hear a statement from His Excellency, Mr. Carlos Gonzalez, Acting Minister of Economy and Finance of Panama. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Muy buenos días, estimados.
Good morning, esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone present. First of all, we would very much like to thank the organizers for the trust you have given us as a country to be a host, specifically in regards to this climate week. We do hope to develop workshops that would allow us to guide, but also to align public finances and private finances in regards to the Paris Accords. As we all know, the Paris Agreement proposes seeking out and increasing capacities within the countries to be able to face the effects of climate change and ensuring that the funding is coherent with a low level of emissions of the GHGs and to ensure that it's climate resilient. This agreement has an ambition to ensure that the countries, in regards to its financial flows, should be consistent with a model of inclusive, resilient, and low emission of GHG model. Another very important element is that Panama, because of its geographic position, it's highly vulnerable to the impact of climate change. There is an increase in meteorological phenomena that have been exacerbated by climate change, like tropical storms, floodings, and also droughts. All of this has a significant impact on the health and the safety of people, ecosystems, and the productive system, specifically the livelihood that is necessary for the population that is poorest in our country. Something else that it's important to highlight, that Panama, being a country that's so small, of only 75,000 square kilometers, can feel all these events simultaneously. Aware of all these threats, the government of Panama has taken steps and actions in regards to integrating climate action at the highest level in the past 5 years, specifically by the alignment of the climate and in regards to the SDGs and its alignment. We're now working on our NDCs too, to be able to increase our climate vision, our socio-economic vision, to ensure that it's inclusive, low emissions, and resilient to climate change by 2050. These are elements that would define actions to be able to maintain its carbon sink status and to define the route to create sustainable finance instruments that are in accordance with the financial flows, just like the Paris Accord state. In this framework, Panama has developed strategies so that the public and the private sector are able to align the financial flows towards resilient development and also low emission of GHGs. In the case of the public sector, Panama has started a process of the transformation of the way in which the national budget is carried out and also public investment. We are now working on a budget based on results, and we've started a process of climate change in a cross-cutting manner in regards to public investment, to what today we call sustainable finance, climate finance, and green or blue projects, so that they can become the standard, the way in which we usually work. So the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment are working together in integrating climate change in public investment. For this process, we have used two working instruments. First, the Manual of Application of Labeling for Climate Change for Public Investment Projects, which allows the Ministry of finance to be able to verify investment projects based on the level of vulnerability and the climate risk, but also the adaptation, mitigation, and cross-cutting criteria, which are quite relevant. Number two, we are working on a technical guide in regards to climate change for planning of public investment programs that provide it's a guide for those responsible of planning in regards to how to facilitate bringing about climate change in regards to the investment projects. This process seeks to ensure that green and blue projects become the standard, facilitating its development and implementation. We've been able to train out the institution of the non-financial public sector, specifically giving a priority to those that are not directly involved in regards to compliance with our climate commitments. So this process, at this moment, it would allow that 20% of the climate investment is identified in the general budget of the state for the year 2023. It also brings about climate change criteria. As a gradual process, we aspire that every year the budget that is approved by the state can increase this percentage. This portfolio of projects identified through this process becomes the foundation so that the national government, after a macroeconomic analysis, is able to access climate financial mechanisms like sustainable sovereign bonds. And also specifically when we talk about debt for nature swap agreements, just to mention a few, we foresee that this climate finance instruments would have a competitive advantage for Panama in comparison to the traditional finance instruments, specifically because Panama is considered carbon negative. Right now, we're also working on the fact that the Ministry of Environment, along with the Ministry of Economy and Finance, has been working with the national financial system in a framework of a sustainable finance task force, which was created in 2018 to be able to ensure that Panama has an inclusive, resilient, and sustainable economy. In this year, 2023, Panama is now executing a readiness for climate action to be able to align the private financial system to the Paris Agreement. This is allowing us to advance in the sustainable taxonomy for banks, insurance, reinsurance, and also securities. Not only with a robust component in regards to mitigation, but also in regards to adaptation. After a broad consultation with the participation of experts, sustainable taxonomy, it's now under a public consultation, and we hope that it can be officially launched by January of next year. We will also start in the strengthening of capacities for climate risk management and to ensure that we have environmental and social safeguards in place. These sustainable taxonomies will be interoperable with other taxonomies at a regional and global level. For example, the one from the EU and also at a regional level for Latin America. This element adds to the actions already undertaken by the private sector to increase the issuance of blue bonds in the national and international markets. Ladies and gentlemen, Panama seeks to address the challenges of climate change in a very comprehensive and ambitious manner. We do hope that we can generate tools so that all the different sectors within the country are able to align the financial flows to the Paris Agreement and to be able to adapt by decreasing and preventing the vulnerability in regards to climate impacts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Fernando Andres Lopez Larrinaga, Minister of Environment and Natural Resources of El Salvador. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Gracias.
Thank you. Good morning. Special greetings to all the participants in this great event, such an important event for our region, for our planet. Our region is at a critical point. As we know, climate change threatens even more our livelihoods, our economies. The impacts of the climate variability and extreme hydrometeorological events are even more evident in our countries, affecting key sectors like agriculture, infrastructure, health, and water safety. El Salvador has 20,000 square kilometers, and even though our CO2 emissions are limited, we witness the devastation caused by extreme climate phenomena, from intense rain through prolonged droughts. Both phases of this reality have a direct impact in the quality of life of our populations, economies, and in the sustainability of our countries. Therefore, climate change adaptation is important in the region. We had advanced an action plan including different sectors, and it is reflected in our national plan to climate change adaptation. We have reinforced our natural systems, reforested thousands of areas, and we are creating environmental evaluation processes. And I'm sure that each one of these actions will resonate on each one of your nations. However, this is important. We still need to do more. We need to work more. We need adequate financial systems so we can carry out all these actions. Reason why we demand to comply all the equity and common responsibilities principles as established in this convention. In El Salvador, we have created the Climate Change Funding Table, working with the Treasury, trying to mobilize the resources for the climate funding and a sustainable investment. Despite all the progresses, we can see gaps in adaptation, and this implementation could advance at a faster pace. Some areas face even greater difficulties, and other areas have gone through a poor implementation, meaning we need to work in a coordinated manner, not only the governments, but also cooperation entities and funding mechanisms. All the mechanisms that we already know must be more nimble and accessible to the realities of each one of our countries. As leaders in the Central American region and through the environmental unification mechanisms, this platform, we need to come together and act in the next COP. We need to press for agreements to focus on adaptation, but also we need to press for the provision of resources for loss and damages. Loss and damages is a topic that is extremely important in our region. We have economic losses, we have harvest losses, and we can even lose human lives. El Salvador is changing steadily, and I would like to encourage you to work together so we can respond to our decisions. Our nations need the commitment of all the stakeholders, all the actors, public, private. Working with the private sector is important so we can create adaptation actions before we reach a point of no return. I think that together we can face the challenge and get ready for a safer and more sustainable future in the Central American region and our planet. The action is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Orlando Habet, Minister of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management of Belize. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Good day, honorable members, excellencies. I thank you for affording me the opportunity to speak to you today at today's forum. I further extend our appreciation to the country of Panama for hosting these prestigious knowledge-sharing events. Colleagues, I share a few words today about some of Belize's strengths and challenges when addressing the country's climate finance needs and adaptation initiatives. In trying our endeavor best to meet the challenges associated with climate adaptation, we must all use the very limited resources at our disposal as efficiently and transparently as possible. Like most, Belize is committed to meeting its global obligations under the Paris Agreement and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. As Belize moves towards a more sustainable and resilient economy, Belize is focused on achieving our national policies and frameworks in order to meet the needs and challenges of our country's climate finance requirements. Of these policies, Belize's updated nationally determined contribution is key, representing far more ambition as it lays out a plan to address the effects of climate change. Additionally, our national climate finance strategy and policy, which lays out how we plan on achieving our contributions under the Paris Agreement, ties directly the targets formulated by the NDC. The climate finance strategy and landscape of Belize comprehensively map out the path toward mobilizing financial resources and implementing priority actions in Belize for the period 2021 to 2026. These actions are to be achieved by enhancing national capacities to mobilize and utilize the resources required to meet our positive climate change activities. Delegates, we have our plan, and accessing climate finance is of the utmost urgency for us as vulnerable, developing countries. Accessing climate finance is critical to us for several reasons, such as building resiliency to adapt to the changing conditions, which may lessen the economic impacts associated with climatic events while continuing the efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Given Belize's many initiatives in accessing climate finance, there are still many barriers that need to be addressed within the climate finance arena. Developing countries are often hindered by limited human and financial resources and technical expertise to develop and implement climate projects effectively. This, along with the long, complex, time-consuming and inflexible processes for application and approvals, are extremely costly to push the review and approval process. Lack of robust data and information to support project proposals and track progress especially impacts the climate-related justification that is needed for its acceptance. Accessing all data has always been an issue for developing countries, given our slow uptake on digitalization and its high cost of entry. Couple this with manual data requiring significant human resources to provide data analysis puts us at a disadvantage. This, along with the fragmented climate finance landscape, makes it challenging for developing countries to navigate and access finance from different sources. Developing countries have naturally gravitated toward adaptation activities given our vulnerable status and minute emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. We are grateful to the Adaptation Fund for facilitating many of our projects to adapt to the challenges brought on by climate change. As developing countries, we must ensure the safety of our people through improved and resilient infrastructure, policies that seek to safeguard citizens and climate-smart agricultural practices. Therefore, it is imperative that accessibility to greater resources is made available for quick response and rebuilding. As the discussions for the loss and damage funding arrangements continue, we ask that you look at the effectiveness of the fund, the efficiency of accessibility by vulnerable nations, by ensuring adequate mechanisms that are put in place to rapidly respond to the urgent needs of these countries suffering from loss and damage. Furthermore, we need to look at the loss and damage funds for a viable way for developing countries to recover, not only from the impacts of extreme weather events, but slow onset events as well. Belize recently suffered the effects of a Category 1 hurricane that left many parts of Belize City destroyed. By the grace of God, no deaths were reported. However, Belize sustained substantial damage to roads, drains, buildings, and other public infrastructure, utilities, agricultural crops, livestock, tourism destinations, and the fisheries sector. Losses were estimated up to $100 million that would see many businesses and lives take several months to recuperate. All that destruction and loss was caused by a Category 1 hurricane. We fear to think what may come as hurricanes intensify year over year due to the effects of climate change. All countries need to agree on a way forward on funding and implementing the Loss and Damage Fund immediately to help developing countries rebuild not only infrastructure but lives after such natural disasters. Members, developing countries like Belize have committed to the Paris Agreement. I am sure we can all agree that if these barriers are not addressed and the cost of entry is not easily accessible, we as developing countries will have increased vulnerability and economic, social, and health impacts. Accessibility will only be met if we can standardize processes, approval times, and make them within our countries' capacities. We must all be held accountable in our fight against the negative effects of climate change, and we must ensure climate finance is accessible to all countries who are currently suffering the climatic effects. In conclusion, we have a long way to go to achieve all our ambitious goals. With limited resources and in a rapidly changing climate, we must all act swiftly and decisively. Belize is committed to transparency in all our actions and to be accountable to our financial partners and our citizens. Our climate finance definition and platform are a giant leap towards exploring more options for achieving our ambitious NDC targets. As well, we are committed to working on our adaptation activities and ensuring that projects, policies, and development all go hand in hand as a nation that wants the best for its citizens and for a greener tomorrow. We continue to hope for more accessible climate financing based on our country's needs for a sustainable future. We are grateful once again for the invite to the Latin American Caribbean Climate Conference in Panama City, and will continue to dialogue on how we, as a region, can continue to strengthen our positive climate change activities. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Juan Carbandi, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Argentina. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'm very thankful to the host country and to all the different agencies involved in this very important meeting where we are today. Very sincerely, first of all, I do have a very pessimistic reflection in regards to the current situation at this point. I don't mean the technical and scientific information that describe a very concerning situation in regards to climate change and its consequence. I think we're all aware of that. My pessimistic stance at this point is in regards to global meetings in regards to the environmental or pollution agenda or climate change or the loss of biodiversity, mainly because of the inequalities that we see in the framework of these discussions when we talk about responsibilities and of financing. Everyone's aware that financing is scarce and that the organizations that provide this very financing are many times very bureaucratic. And also, we find a situation that is very unequal in regards to the developing countries and the countries that are already developed. Developed countries aren't really accountable. And it does not mean that everyone does not have a certain amount of accountability. I think that every country has its shared burden. But since Rio 1992, that we have been talking about shared responsibilities, shared but different. And when we talk about financing to the countries that have a dual challenge, it's very scarce, it's not enough. If we do not modify the financing architecture to be able to mobilize and speed up receiving resources, we will continue to add more burdens and more inconveniences. The truth is that many times we find ourselves in very technical and procedural discussions, and they are necessary to have. But what is also true, it seems that in each international meeting, we stray from our focus. There's a proposition of new mechanisms, of new goals, of new objectives, new targets, and they request a lot more mitigations, and we do not put the adaptation agenda right at the center and also resource mobilization into it. Latin America and the Caribbean, it's the green lung. Aside of providing ecosystemic services because of the biological biodiversity, because of the mangroves it has, each of the ecosystems that we have which should hold us in a different position, not privileged, but different. Latin America and the Caribbean, we provide environmental credit to the rest of the world. And we have about 40% of the biodiversity of the planet. So if we don't care for each of the ecosystems in our region, the world would be at risk. So this is where we have the common objectives and common problems in regards to the challenges that all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have, which is to be able to pay off a debt that we have, that we've been dragging behind us from the 20th century. Structural poverty, the lack of infrastructure. But we also have another challenge, which is the challenge of the 21st century, which is sustainability itself, conservation, and also the targets like the ones established in Paris. But in international meetings, I feel that we are straying from our focus, and I want to be very specific. The new global adaptation goal, we should show the results of the negotiations, the means and the goals. There doesn't seem to be any concrete advancement in regards to that new global adaptation goal. Even in Latin America, in different groups, when we talk about water and LAC, and we've proposed several goals, but they were not taken into account. The discussion of a new quantitative goal by 2024. There is no substantive advancements. We see differences in regards to developed countries and developing countries. The loss and damages fund doesn't have a structure to be able to execute it. So when is it that we are going to discuss what the developed countries would be providing, and in what deadlines? We never discussed this, about $100 billion, and we've talked about this since COP in 2009. So many years have gone by, and we don't execute any of this. We need to understand and have a restructuring of the global financial architecture. Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. But there are also other challenges. Everything's not negative. There's a challenge in regards to generating our own mechanisms. The region could generate its own mechanism, which could be independent to what the convention states. For example, we have the financial support of Latin American institutions, which are a lot more agile in comparison to the UN, like IDB and CAF. So the pessimistic reflection on the one hand, but also holding on to unity, which begs that we work together because of our shared challenges. We must raise our voices to be able to claim the need to defend our region. Because regardless of all the efforts that we put into this, without even having the financing of the big economic powers, without a doubt, which have generated the greatest amount of GHG emissions. More than 80% of the GHG emissions are from the northern hemisphere, but they do not include island states or the countries in Central America. It's the big powers, meaning that the southern hemisphere represents less than 20% of GHG emissions. Quite interesting. Environmental financing It's given a lot more to developed countries than developing countries. It sounds like a bad joke, but it's not. So if we don't really take hold of this idea that the only possible way out is a sustainable but balanced world, but then nothing would be easy. We have this challenge ahead of us. And I have faith, I have hope that we will be able to achieve this united. Latin America and the Caribbean united together as one. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is now my pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Matthew Samuda, Minister responsible for land, the environment, climate change and investment in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, Jamaica. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. I am pleased to present Jamaica's views in this high-level segment at the LAC Climate Week. Jamaica uses the opportunity to thank the UNFCCC Secretariat, the Government of Panama, and the COP presidencies for their efforts in hosting the LACCW 2023. Mr. Chairman, President, Excellencies, this year has been another unprecedented one. People continue to grapple with multiple hazards, further straining already fragile economies and the natural resources on which we rely. The impact on lives around the world has been devastating. Our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, and more broadly, small island developing states and low-lying countries continue to be faced with the harsh reminder that climate change is real and the impacts are far-reaching. Climate change is a reality. Our impact from and exposure to climate and weather extremes, such as increased drought conditions, periods of intense rainfall and stronger storms, and to slow onset events such as sea level rise and increasingly high temperatures, threaten our path to success to meet the goals of sustainable development towards a low carbon and climate resilient society. With Jamaica's ratification of the Paris Agreement in 2017, it continues to increase its ambition to meet the objectives of this global agreement. But of course, the ability to access much needed funding to undertake the tremendous national responsibilities to protect lives and livelihoods is important. Chair, Mr. President, Excellencies, the goal of $100 billion per year by 2020, formally agreed to by the advanced economies developed countries, was never achieved. The existing funding available is inadequate and limited to meet existing and expected climate challenges. The existing financing mechanism must be sufficiently amenable to the needs of developing countries and countries with economies in transition to meet the objectives of international agreements. The GCF and indeed the GEF must earnestly explore the potential concept or idea for a special allocation to SIDS and LDCs to address related environmental and climate change challenges. The access to funding facilities to tackle climate change is often hindered by an irrational need for the justification of vulnerability of SIDS and LDCs. As Chair, Mr. President, it should now be extremely clear for the world to see how climate change threatens our very existence. The inhibitions and delays to access the funding needs have to be removed. Despite the issues with the global financial architecture, it's not all doom and gloom. Jamaica has recently engaged the IMF for a resilience and sustainability facility arrangement, not to be confused with an emergency credit line, for some $764 million. Reforms in the RSF build on Jamaica's homegrown climate policy, were prepared in close collaboration with the World Bank and other international partners. They create incentives to switch to renewables, reduce energy consumption, develop green financial instruments, and require proper management of climate risks in the financial sector. Reforms are expected to catalyze private and official financing for climate-related investment. It is a three-pronged approach that is being used to deploy this capital. One, a project preparation facility to develop a pipeline of resilient climate-smart PPPs. Two, a new Jamaican green financing facility domiciled in Jamaica with the GCF and EIB partnering. Three, a more resilient infrastructure through low-cost, long-term loan instruments. Though this is a large facility with a strategic approach, it is still way below the adaptation needs of Jamaica. It is impatient of debate that the global financial architecture and mechanisms must change. I'd like to share some quick thoughts. Over the period 2013 to 2020, 64% of resilience finance for SIDS was grant-based and 36% in the form of loans. And of those loans, 62% concessional. We must increase the level of grant financing made available to SIDS. We must significantly reduce the time for countries seeking accreditation to access funds under the GCF. We must have a dedicated SIDS envelope under the GCF's Enhanced Direct Access pilot that would provide a short to medium-term solution for a dedicated financing mechanism for SIDS as it builds off the existing climate finance architecture. We must ensure a pragmatic and predictable stream of funds to address the underlying determinants of vulnerability and to finance new development paradigms and to turn SIDS vulnerabilities into strengths. We must also have more effective use of concessional finance to mobilize a broader set of resources for sustainable development. There needs to be implementation of innovative, new, and emerging blended finance arrangements and financial instruments such as green and blue bonds to help mobilize finance from private investors. Despite Jamaica having reduced debt burdens and improved domestic resources, we are not there yet. We have a far way to go. The lack of international finance instruments severely limit our ability to invest in critical measures to minimize the impacts of extreme weather and shocks at the speed that we must. We must look to reduce the time to develop known good practices, standards and regulations and legislation. Harmonization of procedures and practices to accessing climate finance are critical. SIDS public sectors inherently face major human and technical capacity constraints through the project cycle from project origination to implementation. The complexity and climate finance landscape and the lack of harmonization among the requirements of multilateral climate change funds and donors further exacerbate the challenge. Chair, Mr. President, Excellencies, the task before us is not impossible. But the longer we spend talking instead of acting to resolve these challenges makes the mountain peak gradually steeper. Finally, let me once again extend Jamaica's gratitude to the government and people of Panama and wish for a successful outcome during discussions here at LAC Week 2023.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is now my pleasure to welcome Mr. Miguel Angel Jawan Cid, Head of the International Affairs Unit, speaking on behalf of the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources of Mexico. Mr. Cid, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, estimada.
Thank you, dear ministers, colleagues, friends from Latin America and the Caribbean. On behalf of the minister, I would like to greet and especially thank Minister Milciades for his generosity for hosting us in Panama for this important event. It is an honor for me to share the firm commitment that Mexico has in the fight against climate change when we face an environmental and social crisis as a humanity. We recognize the importance and urgency to find a balance between mitigation and adaptation. and also to reflect on the mechanisms that allow us to agilize the funding for climate change. As you know, Mexico updated the NDC during last year's COP with a clear focus on adaptation. The characteristics of our country and the region places us in a paradox between biodiversity and adaptation and vulnerability to climate change, forcing us to have an approach based on social and environmental justice, prioritizing adaptation as the present and not the future for our communities, including loss and damages. Today, we had a Category 5 hurricane in Mexico, and it puts us in a situation. Many countries sometimes think only in the future, but the region cannot think in the future without paying attention to the present. Therefore, Mexico has paid attention to nature-based solutions as a mechanism to coordinate mitigation and adaptation. We're developing the Blue Carbon National Strategy, creating new protected natural areas, working with communities. Also implementing the program Sembrando Vidas, Planting Lives, the reforestation program that is largest in the world, seeking not only environmental but also social benefits. These actions consider the environmental dimension, but also recognizing traditional knowledge and practices, contributing to the social well-being through a social and solidarious economy, boosting the regeneration of the social fabric and the presence of communities. The drastic change in climate and governance is the real participation of the people from and for their territories. We need to move from discourses into action. Therefore, the relevance of funding is not only when and how much we need, but we must rethink on a way to access to funds, being communities the real guardianships of biodiversity, implementing with resiliency adaptation strategies, and they have the least responsibility in the problems, but also they get very few financial resources. We recognize the key role of multilateral funds, but we have also identified opportunities to strengthen the advocacy for projects in the territory with flexible and agile funding mechanisms, ensuring the present and preventing the negative impact of climate change. Therefore, we believe funding must be sensitive to national contexts and regional contexts, always highlighting that vulnerability and available resources shall not be diluted in overheads, diagnostics, and consultations to get information we already have, just like our president says. Less desktop work and more field work. From Mexico, we strengthen the local communities working with indigenous peoples trying to get access to funding. This is a priority, proving that they are not only highly responsible managing the resources, but also highly effective in the protection and caring for the environment. Mexico is convinced that adaptation processes represent a complex reality for multiple groups that have been continuously in vulnerable situations. The youth, women, indigenous peoples, so including them in conversations and giving them direct access to the available funding mechanisms will allow a better implementation of projects, programs, and public policies at the regional level. I would like to reiterate Mexico's commitment to continue working with the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, recognizing the need of the voices of the region, not only in this space and COP28, to include the agendas and commitments of other multilateral environmental agendas, without forgetting that our peoples and communities are the core of the decisions that governments make on climate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sid. I now have the honor to welcome the statement from partner organizations and civil society. To start, it is my pleasure to welcome Mrs. Montserrat Schilot, Senior Regional Advisor on Climate Change Adaptation, UNDP Regional Hub for Environment in Latin America and the Caribbean. Mrs. Keynote, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will do my presentation in English.
Climate change in the LAC will represent a challenge to the region's development goals by impacting food and water security, health, economic growth, and migration patterns. These challenges will be additional to the various hazards that we have seen in the past, such as hurricanes and tropical storms. Areas that have not seen flooding in the past will begin to face new realities in the form of the dual threats from both drought and flooding. For example, in food insecurity, increased temperatures are projected to result in a reduction of basic grain productions at 19% in the case of beans, up to 21% in the case of maize, and 23% of rice in the Central American region by 2050. In a 1.5-degree scenario, the population that will be affected by extreme precipitation in Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina will double. In Ecuador, it will triple and quadruple in the case of Peru. We need to be prepared for this new reality that we will be facing in our immediate future and do so while avoiding the past structural challenges, such as inequality and short-term political commitments. The Adaptation Gap report from 2022 cites global estimates on the need to invest $71 billion per year by countries from now to 2030 to properly adapt to climate change. Therefore, there is an increasing need for governments to better mobilize funds, not only as an immediate response to climate hazards, but to begin to preemptively invest in adapting food systems, enhancing water infrastructure, building codes, and tailoring early alerts to respond to vector and other climate-related diseases such as malaria and dengue. Investing just $800 million in early warning systems could provide between $3 to $16 billion in savings from reduced damages. UNDP has been working with partner countries by creating long-term strategies and adaptation frameworks linked to NDCs. Through projects like Climate Promise, UNDP has enhanced the ambition and adaptation of 23 countries by linking national adaptation plans to NDCs and supporting financial frameworks for their actual investment and materialization. Through the joint UNDP and UNEP Global National Adaptation Program, UNDP has provided support to Haiti, Ecuador, Uruguay, and Cuba in shaping their national adaptation plans, focusing on integrated areas such as urban development and water management. And through the Adaptation Pipeline Accelerator, UNDP is providing enabling support to the Dominican Republic, Suriname, Ecuador, Belize, and Grenada to bridge a critical capacity gap that exists between adaptation planning and adaptation investment. This includes to better identify the climate adaptation needs through hydrological climate modeling and vulnerability assessments in health to be able to inform feasibility studies and making a financial case for investing in adaptation. There's a real strong need to enhance regional capacities to enable the better costing and identification of adaptation needs while integrating these into national fiscal policies and planning, and providing the countries with the technical information they need to be able to crowd in adaptation investment. We need to be able to make this financial case in a way that really attracts private sector and different partners to crowd in. Finally, UNDP has been able to link enabling conditions to concrete adaptation investments through a $100 million portfolio on adaptation focused on coastal resilience, food, water security, and climate finance by building in the region's greatest assets, its ecosystems. Estimates have put the annual value of regional terrestrial ecosystem benefits at $15.3 billion, the majority of these linked to adaptation. As a region, we have a unique opportunity to tackle both the climate and the nature crisis for the mutual benefit of communities and ecosystems. UNDP has been a leading proponent within the region on ecosystem-based adaptation approaches as a means to adapt, and to do so in a way that puts communities and local adaptation solutions at the center. Adaptation, to be effective, must be local. The work we are doing through a biofin program has allowed governments to begin to identify financial strategies and mechanisms to better serve these joint needs at various scales. We continue to work with partner governments and partner agencies to gain the knowledge and tools that are required to unlock the potential of the region while meeting this pressing climate challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quilot. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Mr. Gonzalo Munoz, High-Level Champion Global Ambassador. Mr. Munoz, you have the floor.
Muy buenas tardes. Quisiera comenzar.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. First, I'd like to start by thanking the government of Panama, the Secretariat, and all the organizing agencies of this event for allowing me to address this audience and to be able to position what we see as some of the most advanced solutions in regards to adaptation and finance. In 2019, I had the privilege of being named a high-level champion of COP25 by the government of Chile, and in the COP in Madrid that year, we achieved the mandate that the parties agreed in a Paris Agreement in 2015 was renewed for another 5 years, and then in Glasgow at COP26, the high-level champions presented to the parties and was adopted a plan for acceleration of our ambition from non-state actors, national finance and companies and all the non-state actors representing the civil society for the compliance of the Paris Accords. And of course, when we talk about climate action, most of this action really refers to regions that are developed, and it refers to mitigation. This is part of the history that we've had to delve into. And this is why in 2020, the high-level champions and the non-state actors, we launched a global campaign which was highly relevant and ambitious, which is called Race to Resilience. Quite proud of being the Secretariat at CR2 with Minister Rojas here. I'm so proud to say that Chile has been present in that campaign ever since. The campaign has elevated adaptation and resiliency to the same level as mitigation when we talk about non-state actors. And let me tell you that this campaign today includes 86 cities, 36 big partners covering more than 2,000 members that are implementing actions for the adaptation and the resiliency in more than 150 countries in the world. Together, these over 2,000 members are today ensuring that we have commitments to increase the resiliency of 3 billion people by 2030. This is something that we had not seen previously, and it's a tool that is now available for state and non-state actors of the entire world to be able to participate in. Of taking these efforts to the next level, last year in COP27 in Egypt, the high-level champions had the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda, a group of 30 solutions that are prioritized to be able to advance in adaptation and resiliency by 2030. Bringing about, as I mentioned, the efforts of multiple stakeholders from different areas of society. Today, in my role as a global ambassador of the different campaigns of the high-level champions, I have the privilege of working closely to the two high-level champions, Dr. Mahmoud Mohideen of COP27 and His Excellency Rassam Al-Mubarak from COP28. And I'd like to just talk about some priorities that have been defined for this moment, and fundamentally that will be launched or strengthened in the agenda towards COP28. The first, of course, very much related to what Dr. Mahmoud Mohideen has stated as a specialist in finance in the last few years, and one of the main priorities, specifically in the agenda of climate action, is precisely to generate climate finance that is accessible and that is adequate and accessible for different regions in the world. One of the things that have been done is the pipeline of finance projects that have been worked on with ECLAC. These are projects that are now presented by countries. And this pipeline of projects, it's something that we've worked on to be able to improve access to climate finance with an adaptation focus in each of the countries in our region. The second important focus is to be able to advance in regards to nature and adaptation finance. Specifically, when we talk about debt swap, specifically we're working like the Sharm el Sheikh adaptation agenda facilitates these mechanisms for the countries, specifically from the non-state actor finance. We have also worked specifically with insurance companies. High-level champions have worked with the Admian Archen Rockefeller Foundation, with UNFPI and the Insurance Development Forum and the Institutional and Investment Group on Climate Change. We have been able to develop mechanisms and calls to actions from the insurance sector to be able to advance in mechanisms that are able to improve the conditions and the tools and the role of insurance itself in regards to climate finance. Another very important milestone, in a few hours we will launch G Funds for Latin America. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero has an initiative focused on Latin America, where we are aligning all the different stakeholders of the financial world in regards to the compliance of the Paris Accords, focusing on finance for zero net emissions by 2050, with an amount of actions that are being carried out by the financial stakeholders, insurance, finance asset holders, and banking. His Excellency Rassan Al Mubarak, as we know, as president of IUCN, has had a special focus on nature and working in that nexus between nature and climate, focusing specifically how to strengthen the concrete actions that non-state actors should do to strengthen this bond. The first is to really be able to bring a critical mass of companies, financial institutions that can commit to actions as concrete as SBTN, SBT flag, and TNFD. We do hope that in COP28 to have a specific manifestation of these commitments so that we can use it first to be able to mobilize a concrete action towards nature. Another concrete action is in regards to conservation and the restoration of coral reefs, which is a concrete effort of 50 countries and 50 companies that are now working on the breakthrough of coral reefs, trying, of course, to seek new capital that's able to commit to what we call the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. Finance to stop deforestation. We have a strong focus right now in regards to how to accelerate the commitments that are able to eliminate those finances in regards to commodities very much linked to deforestation. It's part of the work in regards to the states with non-state actors. And finally, my role as the chair of the non-state actors in the strategy of food systems and agriculture of COP28, in supporting the role of the high-level champions to be able to have a call to action of the non-state actors worldwide to be able to commit the transformation of the food systems for climate, people, and nature. The work that we are now doing brings about a call to action that are as concrete as the methane agenda, as concrete as stopping deforestation, regenerative fisheries, and agriculture. And we're working on phenomena that really involve the distribution of food in the case of cities, how to stop food waste in everything related to improving diets, guaranteeing food security within the entire region. These are some of the opportunities that are clear and critical for our region. The high-level champions and the climate action agenda are very much aligned with providing concrete adaptation and resiliency actions. This requires all of society. Without a doubt, all the connections conditions are aligning for radical change. And this is the reason why 20 leaders, among which I would like to include myself, we've delivered a letter with a call to brave leadership from our region to be able to support us in this global stocktake with an extra push for the response that is necessary to really care for the climate action in the whole world. One of the aspects of this letter is very much related to guaranteeing food security, increasing resiliency, and reducing emissions to reduce in a considerable manner food waste in the entire value chain and promoting healthy diets and sustainable diets to preserve land and water ecosystems and to decrease in stock degradation before 2030 and to restore degraded forest, wetlands, and to increase resiliency of carbon sinks within the systems. I think that today we're in a moment full of opportunities to be able to accelerate solutions for the climate crisis. This is a message for all authorities and the ministers that are here with us today. Please help us help you. Today, we have evidence by non-state actors that are already working on strengthening the collaboration bridge of public-private arena. We have enough evidence. We need to bring down the barriers of lack of trust. And we have this ambition described in the Paris Accords as now very much active. And without a doubt, it's speeding up now in our region. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Munoz. And lastly, we will hear a virtual message from Mr. Benoit Bosquet, World Bank Regional Director for Sustainable Development, Latin American and the Caribbean. I hope the technique will function.
Colleagues, I'd like to express my gratitude to the UNFCCC and the government.
Mr. Busquet, we have connection with you. Please, you have the floor.
Okay, very good. Excellent. Ministras y ministros, damas y caballeros, gracias.
Madam Ministers and Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, I do apologize for being unable to be with you in person in the city of Panama. And if you allow me, I will speak in English, just like my colleague from UNDP.
Thoughts go to the people of Mexico and Acapulco who suffered the landfall of Hurricane Otis this morning. It's the first time in recorded history that an Eastern Pacific hurricane makes landfall with Category 5 intensity. So this is another reminder that every country, no matter how poor or how rich, is affected by climate change. But the poorest are hit the hardest, including in Latin America and the Caribbean region. In our region, climate shocks reduce the income of the poorest 40% of the population by more than double the average of the LAC population, and could push more than 5 million people in the region into extreme poverty by the year 2030. So what is the World Bank doing about it? First, we're deepening our analysis of how a country's economic development and climate objectives can be achieved simultaneously, minimizing the trade-offs between the two. We're doing this through our country climate and development reports, of which 5 are already published for Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Honduras, and Peru, and we're working on a number of them in additional countries. And these analyses are very interesting because they shed light on the climate and economic impacts, cost-benefit ratios, and political economy of climate action. And they help countries prioritize amongst policies and measures, both in adaptation and mitigation. Second, we are significantly increasing our climate finance. Around now, about 35% across the World Bank, but more in the Latin America and Caribbean region, of our financing supports climate action, and half of that goes to adaptation. A recent example for the country of Panama is the Climate Resilience and Green Growth Development Policy loan of $150 million that was approved in April of this year. Third, since we know public budgets alone are not enough for the scale of investments that are needed, we're also mobilizing private investment. We're working with governments and investors to overcome roadblocks and encourage private sector investments in both mitigation and adaptation. And we're helping governments design project pipelines incorporating both public and private finance, which serve development objectives while also strengthening countries' capacity to adapt to climate challenges. And finally, we're increasingly designing innovative and concessional financing instruments to shape the next generation of climate action. So just three fairly recent examples here. The World Bank Treasury helped Colombia issue its green bond. It was the first local currency sovereign green bond in LAC and was very successful in attracting foreign investors into the domestic market. And some of the bond proceeds are used for climate adaptation in the country. Second, in Jamaica, we heard from the Jamaican minister earlier, but we also helped Jamaica issue a CAT bond, a catastrophe bond that provided the government with insurance cover for 3 hurricane seasons. And then most recently, the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank signed a memorandum of understanding to help raise resources also through bonds to finance resilience in the Caribbean region and foster sustainable development in the Amazon. And we hope that working together, these two MDBs can achieve greater impact. So let me conclude by saying that we know adaptation needs in the region are high, and we're well aware, as many ministers have said in the introduction, that the amount of climate finance currently available is not sufficient. It is hard to access and often too expensive. And so we are doing our share. We're simplifying our own World Bank processes and making them more agile and our financing more accessible. Hopefully that will make a difference. Thank you so much for your attention. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Bosquet. With this, the Ministerial segment on adaptation and finance is closed. Thank you, distinguished excellencies, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, for these important statements. I look forward to meeting the ministers at the Ministerial Working Lunch on COP28 expectations, which will be held today at 2 o'clock in room Miraflores. That room is located at this level beside the registration area. This segment on adaptation and finance is hereby adjourned.
you.